desperation as he asked, "Mom, why are all the cards declined? Dana's mother and I can't even pay for lunch. Everyone is staring at us." For a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost, but beneath his panic, I felt a satisfaction so sharp it startled me, because for the first time in a decade, the balance of power between us had shifted, and to understand why, I have to tell you what happened the night before, when my daughter-in-law Dana tore away the last shred of patience I had left. I am 68 years old, a widow who once believed that family meant sacrifice, that a mother's love was measured by how much she gave after my husband died. Ryan and Dana turned me into their personal bank. It began small, an extra bill here, a bit of rent there, and before I knew it, I was financing their entire lifestyle. Every so-called emergency was nothing more than another indulgence when Ryan lost his job. I covered 8 months of rent at $800 each. When Dana needed a professional wardrobe, I put $3,000 on my credit card. When they decided a Hawaiian vacation was necessary for their stress, $5,000 vanished from my savings. They never asked me to come along. "It's a romantic trip, Mom," Ryan would say, as though that explained why I was good enough to pay, but not good enough to join. The last straw before everything broke came 3 months ago. Dana insisted their car was too old and that they needed something safe for the children they hadn't even conceived yet. A down payment of $15,000, 2 years of my savings, disappeared at her request. I handed it over, because I thought it was for the family. That night, as I poured coffee for her and her friends, Dana's syrupy voice cut through my living room like a knife. "That old woman is only good for paying our bills." My son laughed, as if humiliating me in my own home was the funniest joke in the world. I stood there trembling, not from sadness, but from a cold rage I had never felt before. In that moment, something in me shifted. I saw myself clearly through their eyes, not a mother, not even a person, just a wallet with legs. I spent a sleepless night turning that realization over. And by 3 a.m., I made a decision. I sat at my computer, canceled every additional card in my name, closed the shared savings account that only ever paid for their luxuries, and changed every password. By 6 a.m., I had reclaimed my finances and, with them, my dignity. At 9:15 a.m., Ryan called in panic from Crestview Grill, the town's most expensive restaurant, where he was trying to impress Dana's mother. "Mom? What's going on? We can't pay a $200 bill. This is humiliating." His desperation filled my kitchen as I sipped my coffee. Calmly, I told him the truth. I had canceled everything. I was no longer their financier. He raged, pleaded, promised it would be just for today. But I had heard those words for 10 years. My answer was no. What stunned me was not his fear of losing me, but his fear of losing face. His biggest concern was how to explain to Dana's mother that his own mom had cut him off. That was when I understood the depth of their entitlement. For years, they had cared only about their image, their lifestyle, their reputation, never about me. That afternoon, they arrived at my house in a fury. The banging on the oak door my late husband had built echoed like thunder. Dana shouted that I had made them look like beggars. Ryan begged me not to ruin his reputation, and when neither worked, Dana switched to false sweetness. "We know you're upset. Georgia, you have every right, but declining the cards doesn't solve anything. We can talk like adults." I stayed silent, listening from the back patio while birds visited the feeder I had installed last year. When Dana finally called me a coward through my window, I drew back the curtain, met her eyes, and then slowly closed it again. That single motion said more than words ever could. For hours they tried, alternating between threats, manipulations, and pleading. Finally, their voices faded and their car pulled away. But I knew Dana well enough to understand it wasn't over. The calls began soon after from Ryan, from Dana, from her mother, and even from my sister Elaine, who had been fed a story that painted me as unstable. By evening, the narrative had shifted. What had been cruel humiliation was now an innocent joke I had overreacted to. They wanted me to believe I was the problem. But as I sat surrounded by the silence they had once filled with demands, I felt no guilt, only clarity. For years, I had played the role of provider at the cost of my self-respect. That role ended the moment I canceled those cards. The next morning, the house was so quiet I could hear the wall clock marking each second like a small hammer. I plugged the landline back in and let the answering machine play while I prepared breakfast. 14 messages stacked one after another, Dana weeping about reputations, Ryan insisting there had been a misunderstanding, my sister wondering whether I was ill, and a stranger claiming to be a cousin who thought I should forgive and forget. Because family is everything. Family is many things, I thought. But it is not a license to trespass into another person's life and wallet. I ate in peace and realized I was tasting my food, truly tasting it for the first time in years. It felt like the fog in my mind had finally thinned, and beneath it was a hard, level road that I could walk without stumbling. When the doorbell rang, it was not Ryan, nor Dana, but my neighbor Lucy, with a warm smile and a worried tilt in her eyebrows. She said she had heard the shouting the day before and wanted to make sure I was safe. We sat with coffee at the kitchen table, the morning light laying the truth bare. I told her enough to draw the outlines. She filled in the colors I had been reluctant to see. For years, she had watched them arrive in new clothes and late-model cars while I drove my old sedan and clipped coupons. She had never once seen them carry a bag of groceries in for me, fix a loose shutter, or stay for conversation without leaving with money. Being a good mother isn't the same thing as being a martyr, she said, and the sentence struck a resonant chord I had ignored for too long. When she left, I felt less alone and more certain. By 9:00 a.m., I was at the bank, sitting across from the manager while he clicked through my accounts with professional calm. We locked everything down: new passwords, two-factor authentication, alerts for withdrawals, removal of every extra name that had ever grazed the surface of my finances. "It's more common than you think," he said when I asked whether I was overreacting. "Protecting yourself is not hostility. It is prudence." As I signed the last form, I pictured the shared savings account I had foolishly labeled emergencies. It had rarely been emergency medical bills or broken boilers. It had been designer labels and celebratory dinners. I closed it with one signature and felt a decade slip from my shoulders. I took myself to lunch at a small bistro I had admired but never entered. I ordered the special, a glass of wine, and dessert without flinching. The bill came to $45, and I paid it from my own card with a lightness that surprised me. Then I went home, pulled the last 5 years of statements from my desk, and did the arithmetic I had avoided. The number assembled slowly, like a storm gathering on the horizon: $86,000. Not a myth, not a feeling ink on paper. Dates, merchant names, steady outflows that told a story I could no longer pretend was generous instead of destructive. The worst part wasn't the vacations or cars. It was the small, automatic charges for streaming services, boutique gyms, and subscriptions I had never heard of. Luxuries looked like pebbles on a beach until you counted them and realized you were standing on a mountain. At 2:00 p.m., I sat in Mr. Coleman's office with the will I had drafted 5 years earlier. Back then, I had written Ryan's name across everything house. Savings, investments, because grief had made me soft and hope had made me blind. I explained what had happened and what I had learned. He listened without flinching and asked the practical questions that force a woman to define her values. I told him I wanted to divide my estate so that it reflected who I am, not who they decided I should be. Some would go to causes I believed in, some to my sister Elaine, who had never asked for $1. As for my son, I wanted a structure that rewarded adulthood rather than entitlement. We drafted language that would grant him a portion only if he demonstrated a full year of financial independence, no coasting on my accounts, no temporary subsidies, no charades. Mr. Coleman nodded and said it was entirely legal. I left with a sense that I had finally built a door only I could unlock. When I pulled into my driveway, an unfamiliar car waited at the curb. Dana's mother, Claudia, stood on my porch in pearls and practiced concern, inside. She delivered a polished speech about misinterpretations and jokes among women, about how young couples need support, about reputations and church whispers. I asked her whether she paid her adult daughter's rent, vacations, and wardrobes, whether she held credit cards open in her own name for others to swipe. She could not quite meet my eyes when she said no. But that's different. The conversation drifted from honeyed persuasion to veiled warning. She suggested that erratic financial decisions could be a sign of incompetence, and that legal avenues existed to protect a family, by which she meant to wrest control from me if I refused to comply. I stood, and in the cooled steel of my voice, I heard my husband, as he had once been when closing a deal. I told her I had counsel, that prudence is not erratic, and that a woman refusing exploitation is the very definition of competent. Her face tightened and then smoothed. She left with a brittle smile that said she would be back in some other form. That night, the old fear padded around the edges of my bed like a restless cat. What if they truly tried to paint me as unstable? Mr. Coleman's words returned. Firm and sensible, document everything. In the morning, I made an appointment for a psychological evaluation and sat with a clinician for 2 steady hours. I answered questions about memory, reasoning, judgment, and emotions, and I described the past decade plainly. When she finished, she said I was lucid, decisive, and acting in my own best interests. She stamped the report, and I felt something unknot behind my ribs. On the way home, Lucy waved from her garden and told me that Claudia had already been asking around about my behavior. My neighbor had smiled and told her I seemed clearer and happier than ever. The rumor mill was spinning. I could not stop it. But I could refuse to grind my life beneath it. When Lucy invited me to join a 5-day cruise leaving Wednesday, I said yes before doubt could barge back in. The price was $1,500, all inclusive, a decade ago. I would have calculated what Ryan might need next week and stayed home. Now, I calculated how many sunrises I had left to watch from a deck with salt in the air and said, "This one is mine." Sunday morning arrived warm and bright, and for the first time in years, I woke without the weight of expectation pressing on my chest. I brewed coffee and sat on my patio listening to the birds, thinking about the cruise I would soon take with Lucy. Then I heard a car pull into my driveway. It was Ryan, alone this time. He looked exhausted, his clothes wrinkled, his face haggard with dark circles under his eyes. He rang the bell and called softly, "Mom, please. We need to talk. Just you and me." I let him in, but stayed cautious, watching him as if he were a stranger whose motives I hadn't yet measured. His shoulders sagged as he sat, and his voice trembled. "Mom, I don't know what to do." The car insurance is due tomorrow, and I don't have the $250. If I can't renew it, I can't drive legally, and without a car, I'll lose my job." "How much did you earn last month?" I asked. "About $3,500. He muttered. "Then why can't you cover $250? He shifted in his seat. "Because we have expenses: rent, food, utilities, and restaurants, streaming services, memberships," I pressed. He fell silent. His eyes darted to the floor like a child caught in a lie. "Those are basic necessities," he finally whispered. "Basic necessities," I repeated, stunned. "A gym membership is a luxury. Streaming services are entertainment. You are 35 years old. You have a degree, a job, every advantage. And yet you can't pay a bill worth a fraction of your income, for once." He didn't argue. He looked small, like the boy he once was when he admitted he'd done something wrong. Tears welled in his eyes. "Mom, I thought you liked helping us. I thought it was your way of showing love, and it was." "Ryan," I said, my voice sharp with grief. "But you turned my love into obligation. You turned my generosity into expectation. And then you mocked me for it." His face crumpled. He sat in silence for several minutes, his hands twisting together. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. "What can I do to fix this?" "Start by paying your own car insurance," I answered. He nodded slowly, as though absorbing a new truth. When he left an hour later, he seemed changed, frightened still, but thoughtful in a way I hadn't seen in years. On Monday morning, as I packed for my cruise, my phone rang. It was Dana, her voice calmer than I'd ever heard it. "Georgia," she said, "can we meet for coffee? No Ryan, no drama, just us." Curiosity tugged at me, so I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe, and she arrived without her usual armor of jewelry and designer clothes. She looked tired, humbled. "I want to apologize," she began. "What I said about you was cruel. These last days, without your help, I realized something terrible. We don't know how to live within our means. We spend almost double what we earn. You've been covering the gap all along." I listened as she confessed they were moving to a smaller apartment, cutting memberships, and drawing up their first real budget. It was the first time I had heard her speak with anything resembling honesty. Then she asked, "When did you start to resent us?" "When you stopped asking and just started using," I told her. "When my savings became your lifeline, not my own." Dana nodded with shame. "You're right. We saw you as a resource, not as a person." "If you want a relationship with me," I said, "it has to be built on respect and independence. No more seeing me as a bank account." She swallowed hard. "And if we fail, then you fail as adults. But at least you'll fail on your own terms, not mine." Her eyes glistened, and for once she had no clever reply. She thanked me quietly and left. 2 days later, Ryan sent a message. "Mom, I got a personal loan for the insurance. We're moving next month to a cheaper apartment." It wasn't a miracle, but it was something a step toward the independence they had avoided for so long. The cruise was everything I had hoped. 5 days of freedom, laughter with Lucy, sunrises over the sea, meals enjoyed without calculating how much of my savings would be drained next. I met other women my age, many with stories like mine children who had drained their retirements, families who confused generosity with obligation. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. I was part of a quiet army of parents learning to say no. When I returned home, The messages on my phone surprised me. Ryan had called not to beg, but to ask if I had arrived safely. Dana left a short note hoping I enjoyed the trip. The shift was small but unmistakable. A day later, Ryan came to see me again. He looked nervous but different, steadier. "Mom," he said, "we've made changes. We're paying less rent now. Dana picked up a part-time job. We canceled the expensive gym. And I want to apologize. Not just for that day, but for all the years we treated you like a bank." I didn't realize how heavy that was until it ended. For the first time, I feel like an adult. I searched his face for signs of manipulation, but saw only sincerity. "Then maybe we can start again," I said gently. "A son and a mother, not a debtor and a creditor." He smiled faintly. "Can we come for lunch on Sunday? We'll bring the food and cook." "Yes," I said, and for the first time in a decade, the answer felt easy. The following Sunday came, and true to his word, Ryan arrived with Dana carrying bags of groceries. There were no designer labels, no smug smiles, only the awkward eagerness of two people trying to rebuild something fragile. They cooked in my kitchen, asking where I kept spices, how I liked my vegetables cut. The meal was simple roast chicken, potatoes, and a salad, but it felt like a banquet, for the first time in years. My home was filled with conversation that wasn't about money. We laughed over small mistakes in the kitchen, and when we finally sat down to eat, Ryan raised his glass of water and said, "To new beginnings." My heart softened, though caution still lingered at the edges. That night, after they left, I called Mr. Coleman again. I explained what had happened, how Ryan seemed genuinely changed, and asked whether we could adjust the will we had revised only days earlier. "You want to leave room for hope," he said after a pause. "We can create a tiered structure, portions released only after clear evidence of independence." I agreed. The new plan would allow Ryan access to increasing shares if he demonstrated consistent responsibility 2 years, then 5. If he slipped back into old patterns, the inheritance would remain limited. It was a way to honor growth without rewarding entitlement. For the first time, I was planning my future not out of fear of exploitation, but in cautious hope that my son could rise to the challenge of adulthood. The changes in Ryan and Dana's lives became visible quickly, within weeks. They moved to the smaller apartment. Ryan admitted it was an adjustment, but he also confessed he slept more peacefully, knowing every bill was paid with their own earnings. Dana, surprisingly, threw herself into her new part-time job. "It feels good to bring something to the table," she told me one afternoon when we met for coffee. The pride in her voice was genuine, and for once, she didn't ask for a single thing. I could see the beginnings of humility taking root. Our Sunday lunches became a ritual. Some weeks they brought pasta, others stews or casseroles. The food was never extravagant, but it was made with effort, and effort was something I had long stopped expecting from them. Slowly, the conversations shifted. We talked about their work, their struggles with budgeting, even their arguments about cutting unnecessary expenses. They no longer turned to me for solutions. They turned to each other. It was a change I had prayed for, but never thought I would see. Still, I carried with me the memory of years spent as their safety net, the humiliation of being mocked in my own living room. Forgiveness came slowly, in increments, like the cautious thaw of winter into spring. One afternoon, as we sat together folding laundry after lunch, Ryan said quietly, "Mom, I want you to know that I'll never forget what you did for us all those years. But I also know I took advantage of you. That won't happen again." His eyes held mine, and for the first time in a decade, I believed him. I also began to reclaim pieces of myself that had been buried under obligation. I took small trips with Lucy, redecorated the guest room, even bought myself a new wardrobe, nothing extravagant, but clothes that made me feel comfortable and alive. I found joy in simple things, planting flowers, walking by the river, reading late into the night without dread of an early phone call demanding money. The more I chose myself, the clearer I became, and the more I realized how deeply I had abandoned my own needs for years. One evening, as I sat on my patio under the stars, Ryan stopped by alone. He carried no bags, no bills, no burdens. "Mom," he said, "I just wanted to sit with you for a while." We watched the night settle in silence, and I realized that perhaps this was the relationship I had longed for all along, a son who came not out of need, but out of love. It was fragile, still new, but it was real. The lesson of these months was carved into me as deeply as any scar. Love without boundaries turns into exploitation, and generosity without respect becomes poison. By finally saying no, I hadn't destroyed my family, I had saved it, and myself. I had given Ryan and Dana the chance to grow, and I had given myself the right to live with dignity. If you have ever felt drained by those you love, know this: protecting yourself is not cruelty, it is the highest form of self-respect. And sometimes, the most loving word a parent can say is no. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, please like, share, and subscribe so more people can find strength in these words. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in my place? Until next time, take care of yourself and never forget your worth.